Good afternoon, both to Scott Baker and Sierra Holland. Good to see you both.
Good to see you
Mikey,
too.
how are you? Yeah.
Great.
I'm not ready. I know this is live and we can't start over, but I've got to get because if I don't have the field note number, we can't actually.
The
1645.
cadence of your starting is hard to do if you don't have that number in mind.
1645. That's the number of the field note, which means 1650. It's coming up pretty soon. Now, how good leaders localize the why after announcing major change? That's our headline. I felt I did a major editorial help to everybody that read it, and for those of you hearing, you can just imagine it, that the why initially didn't have the single quotations, because you use single quotations, I was taught as a journalist in the headline. Because originally it just said how to localize the why after, and I was like, what's the why? And then, oh no, it's the why.
Oh.
So that's what we're talking about, the why.
You brought tremendous amount of clarity.
I hope so. I hope so. But this is the kind of thing, this sort of communication clarity that is the Sierra Holland bread and butter.
Yes.
And so
if you hear us talking about the clarity index once or twice, it needs to be mentioned a dozen times on this. So just get those words in your brain, everybody who's watching. Clarity index.
Right, but really the heart of this is the stuff that you see, which is sometimes organizations will be like, we're making this major change. Maybe it's rosy, maybe we're laying people off, and then you're coming in to help consult on the communication strategy. And you know this, that the whole field note is that the leader is going to say, well, the reasons were this, but everybody in the audience is just going, how does this affect me?
Right.
Yeah. And often that's going to be the first question I ask leaders that I'm working with is, how do we make this real for your team specifically? How are they going to be impacted? How is it going to be different in their day-to-day because of this change that's coming, because of this new technology that's coming, because of this new process that we're rolling out, and getting them to talk about, okay, what's really going to be different? What are people going to be able to point to? What are they going to see in their day-to-day that is different? And help us tell that story, because we have to figure out ways to empower leaders to see those things and make that change more tangible for their teams when it comes out.
Yeah, we were just talking about like the tangibility of like making people see what we're talking about. It doesn't apply just to change. It applies to almost every level of organizational communication. But specifically on change, people become a little paranoid, a little self-protective, self-conscious about like what is going on here? Am I going to get laid off is like the common thing. And so setting people at ease is important in there. But when we're talking about change management, where is that specific thing that we're talking about? Because that's the number one question, right? Am I getting laid off? What kind of benefits do I need? What do I have to explain to my wife about what's no longer available to her, right? So at what point is that explained in the localization here? Early?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think where it comes in the conversation, it's going to depend on really what the level of change is itself, and how quickly people are going to really understand what the change is. So I can see a case for having it early in the conversation. I can see a case for having it later on. But what's interesting is people are more familiar with the what's in it for me. But I have a caution against that, because sometimes there isn't a ton that's really in it for people, but we can bring it into their exact context and bring it into how that it's going to change the way that they interact with certain different parts of the organization, how it might make them more connected. What's interesting about the point that you just made, though, is that people are resistant to change. And it's interesting, if you ask people, though, in 5 years, do you want to be the same person that you are today? People will say, no, of course I want to change. I want to grow. I want to be this different, better version of myself. So I think that's an interesting nugget on change. Yeah. But then how can you say, okay, that future version of you that is moving up within the organization, that is connected to different parts of the organization, they're going to have to be using AI. So we're introducing this new AI tool for you. Here's 5 ways that you can be using it today, and really empowering those leaders to make it more tangible for people, make it more relatable, make it more, here's exactly how I can engage with it now. And I would say sometimes I'll get engaged to help people communicate. They're like, everybody needs to know about this, but I'll say, okay, how is this going to be different for people? And if you can't yet answer that question, it's not time to communicate.
Yeah,
If you can't get to that level of granularity, I need you to push yourself to find that before we can really communicate and make this meaningful for folks.
I noticed today OpenAI was talking about their new 5.2 thinking model, and that heavy users of it in the tests were saving 10 hours a week in work time on projects, opening up to work on other things, or freedom to explore other areas of work. But I like the point that you're saying here, Sarah, that it's not necessarily it's not like a greedy selfishness. What's in it for me? It's more the unclarity of how does this affect me. I kind of liken it to the like we've had a number of different dogs over the years, but the current dog, who's fairly calm and quiet, but if there's a car outside or if there's a doorbell, as dogs do, freak out. Cats wouldn't care. They'd be like, yeah, whatever. Dogs are like, and it's just the uncertainty, like there's a disruption in the field of everything. And so until I say, oh, I get it, here's what's going on. So it's not just that the leader has to think, I got to pacify these people who are all just like, gimme, gimme. That's not it. Or they're just scared they're going to lose their job. It's more like you got to just get the territory clear, and then everybody, that threat functionality drops down, right?
Right. Because, and I think there's so many examples of this, but when people are too general, when they're too high level, when they're only thinking about that top reason why we're doing something, people reject it often. If I'm just hearing we're adopting AI to be more efficient, like that's not why I get out of bed every day. I don't get out of bed to be more efficient. But do I get out of bed to be more creative and find new and creative and more well-rounded solutions to our biggest problems through AI? Sure, that's more exciting. That's going to get me, excited to log in for the day, more so than just this blanket of efficiency. So sometimes you might think you have that big reason or that why. You might feel like you've localized it, but how can you get even more specific? If you're not there yet, maybe you need to engage people and figure out what this is really going to look like in practice. Could we do a pilot? Can we get more data so that when we come back to our teams, we can really localize that why even more than we do today?
Okay, so if we say, for instance, as an example of what we're talking about here, that we have a headquarters for a 2,000 person company in downtown Dallas, and they are going to move their headquarters to somewhere in the larger metro area, but closer to the suburbs, right? Because asking people to come south just creates too much. Like there's all kinds of why we're going to move. And then there's the secondary of like, where are we going to move, right? And then there's the third of like, how do we announce what the process where we're going to move is being made? And then it's the actual announcement of the decision of where we're moving, right? This localization happens at every 4 of those stages, right? I mean, at that point, it's complicated to be able to. Plus, you have different people with different levels of buy-in at every one of those stages, because if you had a lot of people trying to get their suggestions in that one of these 7 areas be the spot that we have our new headquarters that are going to be built, how do we get it narrowed down to 3? Then when we're announcing it at that point, then you've got all the stakeholders who are like desperate to have those 4 places that are now off the list, how you communicate with them, in what order you communicate with them. Like at that point, like organizational communication seems like, oh, this is why you make the big bucks, right? To be able to understand in what order. But is it that granular? Do we really need to like consider that at every stage in the way that I just described, or did I make a monkey up?
I would say absolutely. I think the more clarity that you can bring to people, the more they're going to better engage with it and better accept those changes themselves. Because what we often see, going back to the clarity index point, what we see is the people who are clear.
Yes, perfect.
The people who are clear on the strategy, though, are those more senior leaders, because they're part of all those conversations of, well, if we moved our office to this location versus this location, if we had this floor versus those taxes, they're there for all of those different various conversations about why did we actually land on this office versus another one. what often gets missed is the translation of that context to the levels of leaders below them. And then all of a sudden, nobody really knows why we moved offices. Was it to save money on taxes? Was it just that somebody didn't like the office that we had? Was it that we were trying to get closer to our founder who happens to live in the north side of Dallas versus the south side? You know, people are asking themselves all these questions. And if they don't have that same level of strategic context, they can't understand it. They can't understand why they should connect to it, what the benefits could be for them specifically in their role, in their in their location of coming into that office now. So it's interesting. I think if you break it down at each part of that decision-making phase and bring people along, you're going to have them more engaged for the long term around that change.
Well, one of the things you underlined there was talking about like there are leaders down the scale, and that was a question I was going to ask coming out of Mikey's sort of scenario, which is the headline here for the field note is about what good leaders do in localizing. So, and as we get into this, you know, here's the why, here's how it affects everybody on the team, and then it talks about this process of having these conversations pretty quickly. So there's not a lot of dead time in between the announcement and the understanding point. My question is a structural one for you as a communications sort of expert on this, which is how much of that has to come from the top leader or top leaders, and how much of it can be baked into the whole rollout process? And maybe the CEO or the person who makes the announcement gives something directional, but maybe it's not actually appropriate for them to like speak into the lower levels of all of this. I mean, there's a lot of machinations, as we said. So do you structure it that way? Do you think about like, well, this is the thing that we do want the CEO to say, here's what we're going to have everybody's individual team leaders say? What's the better way of doing that?
Yeah, the instinct that you have is the right one, because we do want the CEO or the senior most leader to set the highest level view of that, but people are really going to trust their direct leader the most when it comes to actually what does this change mean? Because we might get an email from the CEO and then we turn to our leader and say, well, what do you really think this is all about? And they're the ones who can more credibly say, well, here's what I understand our thinking was. Here's what I really think this is going to mean for you. You can leave the rest of it. And that direct leader knows what your day-to-day is. They know what your priorities are. They know different solutions you've already tried in your business unit, and they can speak to why this one might be a little bit different. The CEO can't necessarily speak to that with the same level of credibility because they're not there in the day-to-day of your team as much, especially in those larger organizations. So I would say having the CEO set that higher level strategic context, and then allowing and really empowering more direct leaders and the leaders below to make it make sense and help their teams pay attention to what they most need to know in their roles is a really smart way of going about it.
Now, you've done some research work specifically about the medium by which this communication is done. Some are more rich and some are more lean communication channels. And so you just mentioned a scenario where a CEO probably shouldn't speak into some of the minutia details. So if an email is being sent out wide to an organization where some of these details start to bubble up because it's like, oh, that detail should come from the CEO.
Right.
Is maybe a better way to do that for the CEO to say, ask your leader this question. So they're not explaining it in the email itself, but they're teeing up the conversation for the leaders so that they're saying, this is a lean medium. I want to point you to a rich medium here. Right. Is that like a better way to do it instead of feeling like you're putting everything in an email?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the topic that we're talking about. Because if we're talking about something that is more complex, more sensitive, then we definitely need it to be coming voice to voice, face to face ideally, but video face to face so you can see facial expression cues. Somebody can submit questions and have the CEO or the senior most leader respond to it live. That rich communication is much more important for complex, highly sensitive types of topics. When it's more procedural, maybe it's a process or it's something more operational in nature, it's something historical even, that can be all through print. I might not need to ask any live questions about it. Having a really long FAQ guide is okay. People can do Control F and find the question that they're trying to ask. But I think for most larger scale change communications that are going out, you're going to want a mix. You're going to want the voice to voice, face to face, multiple cues, live feedback of a rich medium. But then you're going to need some of those more lean mediums to capture some of the minutia. Maybe it's a fact sheet. Maybe there's an FAQ guide. Maybe there's a website that has even more details that people can interact with. So you'd probably end up with a mix. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that your leaders are prepared to answer those questions before you actually make that announcement.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the sequence matters too of, did we tell leaders before we told the entire employee base? Because if not, employees are looking to their leaders don't have the answers, and then nobody looks good.
Nobody looks good, yeah.
Scott, why are we talking about communication? I thought this was about leadership. Can you wrap it up?
They are simultaneous endeavors. That people that think of good leaders think of good communicators. For everyone who's just listening to the audio on the podcast, I'm looking and nodding very sincerely and seriously, as though I'm sort of profoundly wise. But honestly, in the end, I want some CEO to violate this and just get up and say, "Here's what we're doing. There are going to be no layoffs, except for Kyle. You're gone, Kyle. All right, back to everybody else." Every now and then he would be like, "All right, we're just going to cut through the clutter and say it." Anyway, I'm joking around, but thank you. It's been fun.
Yes. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for those, except for Kyle. Kyle.
Sorry, Kyle.
Sorry about that. All right. See you later.
See ya.